Welcome to a brand new episode of the Front End Happy Hour podcast. I'm not sure why we haven't covered this at all yet as a topic before, but I realized it'd be fun to talk about what it's like to work and live in Silicon Valley. I know it has been an interesting world for me when I moved out here. I think it's been over 10 years now. And I know others have interesting perspectives and experiences to share. So in this episode, we are talking about what it's like to work and live in Silicon Valley. This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio. Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE, leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments, ship faster with an AI code assistant, and work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps on going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Before we dive into the topic, let's give introductions of today's panelists. Stacey, you want to start it off?
Sure. I'm Stacey London. I'm a principal front-end engineer at Atlassian.
Jem
Young, engineering manager at Netflix.
Augustus.
Hi, my name is Augustus. I'm an ex-software engineer at Twitch.
And I'm Ryan Burgess, the host of Front End Happy Hour. All right, let's start. I'm curious for all of you, what was your first impression when you stepped foot into Silicon Valley, when you arrived? What was the biggest surprise for you?
I came out here for like a trip once before we moved out here for my job at Atlassian, or to San Francisco specifically. I came out like a year or two before for a conference. I think that's actually where I met Ryan and Jem, and I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it was such a long time ago, but came out for the conference. And I guess one thing that totally struck me that was just weird about this place is I would go, like, you go out to dinner or you'd go anywhere and inevitably you would hear someone talking about tech around you, which was so different than moved out here from Wisconsin, which has just a mix of a lot of different, people and jobs. And so it's just the concentration of people in tech around here where you just happen to overhear constant talking about venture capital investment and blah, blah, blah. Like you couldn't help but hear that everywhere you go. And it was, I found it very weird, almost like not necessarily off-putting, but just very strange. It was just a new experience.
I remember that, Stacey, your trip there, because I think I had just that year moved to Silicon Valley at that time. Like I'd moved out to the Bay Area. And yeah, we did meet at a conference, and I think it was Ryan Anklam that had introduced us both. I think I'd just met Ryan at that same time. But yeah, I remember we even went to happy hour and things like that after the conference. And it's a different world. I think that was within my first few months being in Silicon Valley, and I know exactly what you're talking about.
So my experience before Silicon Valley, like I was still in school, but my first job was a student web developer at the University of Washington. So very, very, very old stack, and not as Silicon Valley-esque. We weren't even on Git. We were on like Subversion for version control, SVN for version control. It was like very heavy PHP stack. And then also like just thinking of what working was like, my family's very into the finance industry. So when I came here, it was just like, it's very like crazy to see some of the offices that employers had. Like when I came to like on sites and stuff, it was just like, felt like a playground almost. Like it's just so surreal to see like so much investment put into providing like an environment for someone to, I don't know, well, I later understood it was to make the workplace feel fun so that you freaking live there as much as you can or something like that. But like that was like a huge shock for me because I've never seen that.
Yeah, I mean, Augustus, like think about our days at Evernote too. Like there was, that office was beautiful, and we had some really great things. Like, I mean, I remember you making some pretty good lattes and things at the coffee machine because it was like we were spoiled. We got like training on that. But then even like there's like ping pong and things like that. It's just like it is a different world where you're like, yeah, no, that's like built into your work life where there's things to do and kind of keep you there maybe longer. But I like to think in the positive manner on it, where I'm like, it just gives you ability to free up your mind, but also build up like relationships with your team and colleagues. But I think it also has a negative aspect where it's like it keeps you there longer at the job.
Yeah, I guess this with the office thing. I think one thing I struck me immediately too is you going to the various offices, and a lot of them would have like full on bars with like top shelf stuff, and like the alcohol culture was very weird. You know, like in Wisconsin, it's like, yeah, people would go to happy hours and stuff, but like in the office having a bar with like that is super not a thing. And so like coming out here, that was very weird to me to see people like hanging out at work and drinking. It was like, what is happening?
That's a good point, because like I feel like I've been at offices where there's like kegs on tap and things like
Yeah.
that. But then there's even been like places like Dropbox, I'll never forget, where they had like full on bartenders and like chefs and everything. And I mean, granted, that's not just Dropbox, there's many companies like that. But that was my first taste of that, where I was like, wow, this is like a full on party that's happening. And you got served very well. You're right. Like it wasn't cheap alcohol that you were drinking.
My impressions were a little different. I think because I was coming from New York, which has its own tech culture and startup culture. So some of that was kind of familiar, like to going out drinking and having fun and partying and all that. From I think any startup anywhere kind of has the same culture. Some of my first impressions getting here were I wasn't really impressed, because I think I ended up in San Mateo, which is not really a very scenic place to be. It doesn't feel very techy. It just feels like urban sprawl more. And anybody who's been to San Mateo knows what I'm talking about there.
There's some good restaurants there, Jam. There is.
I remember driving down 101 and thinking like, oh wow, there's Evernote. Oh wow, there's Dropbox, and like seeing the names of companies that you've heard of, and you're just like casually passing them by. And I thought that was a really cool first impression of just, all the companies and software that we use that you hear of, there they are. They're all right here. People are working, and seeing the buildings is pretty cool. And then just randomly driving around San Francisco, you'll just see just offices everywhere. You're like, oh, wow. Like driving off in Barcadero in San Francisco, you'll see Mozilla just right there, just casually passing by. And then there's Google right there. So I always thought that was pretty cool. It just depends on where you end up in Silicon Valley on maybe your first impressions.
Jim, that was something else I remember too, is seeing all the billboards around that were all tech focused. It was just like, does your AI need a whatever? Just like you're reading them and you're like, what? Only if you were in tech, and only if you were very deep in tech would you even understand what the billboards were saying.
Oh, they're terrible, Stacey. Yeah, like they're like they're so far removed from anyone. It's like you have to be deep level into that technology to even be like, oh, I get that ad.
It's either a tech billboard or it's the Shen Yun. What is it, like the guy who's like that? Like I don't know why I see that billboard like all the time. Like, but
Jem, was the first time you were in Silicon Valley, was it for your interview at Netflix, or like when you mentioned that you were in San Mateo, what was that for?
Yeah, it was an interview for a company. It wasn't Netflix at the time. It was pre-Netflix. It was one of those, I ended up with two offers. One was in San Francisco and one was in New York. And I went with the New York one at the time. I think part of it was San Mateo wasn't that impressive, but also New York's a fantastic place to be when you're young and single and making money. So probably more so than San Francisco, in my opinion. So yeah, but eventually I ended up here a couple of years later.
I mean, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think like when I first moved out to Silicon Valley, San Mateo is where I landed for the first, like, it was only a few months, but it was like, that's where I ended up. And that's why I like joke and say, like, I'm like, there's some decent restaurants, but yeah, it's like it gets old quick, where I'm like, yeah, I want to be in a city. And that's what led me to at least move to San Francisco at the time. I'd be curious to know, how does the work culture of Silicon Valley differ from other places that you all have worked?
This might just be me, but I feel like there's this extra feeling of hustling that happens. Like, and I don't know, like sometimes I'm trying not to confuse it with like extreme passion to like deliver something, but it's people are just so like, maybe passion is the right word. Like people are just so passionate to get stuff done, get stuff shipped. And especially like when Silicon Valley was first born, the whole motto that Meta, Facebook created, like move fast, break things. Like I feel like everyone kind of resonated and made that like the motto or something, and they really took it to heart. So they rather move quickly and figure things out, like don't work that way, rather than taking some time. So I don't know. There's always, to me, it felt like there's always this kind of rush where like when the work culture, it's like if something needed to get done, they try to do it as quickly as possible. And that was kind of the air that I always kind of felt. I don't know if anyone else feels that way.
Yeah. I think one thing I noticed pretty quickly was that a lot of people, my coworkers and stuff, like a lot of people very much intentionally chose to move here and be here to go deep into tech in a way that like is rewarded and people get excited about it. So there's this like excitement surrounding you with what you're working on in the tech. And I'm trying to feel like what was different. I guess just that, and you use the word passion, Augustus, but a lot of people here wrap their identities around tech and being excellent at their career and really deep in it and spending maybe time outside of work doing, like, they're really, really wrapped up in it. And good and bad, right? Like that can be like bad for people, but it also can be good. Like, so for me, the good part about that was just I was working with people who were excited about JavaScript, and we could have really awesome conversations about JavaScript that I sometimes couldn't find, in some of my other jobs where it wasn't software companies that I was working for primarily. And so like you'd find some people that were excited, but like it was just people's job had a job for different reasons.
Yeah, what I liked about it, I think it's a double-edged sword, I'll say. But what I liked about it too when I kind of moved out here was having people, like, you would go for coffee and you'd overhear people talking about like JavaScript or the latest React framework or whatever it was. And in some ways I'm like, oh, that's so cool. Like you can kind of get excited about being immersed in that. And then there's times where I'm like, yeah, I just want to get my coffee. Like, I don't want to talk about the latest, framework and what that has to do with the implications of the web. But I think in some ways I've thoroughly enjoyed it at the start. I don't know. There's times where I'm like, I just want to disconnect and not want to hear about it. But then there's times where I'm like, yeah, I love that I can just walk into a coffee shop and I kind of overhear people talking about AI or whatever the latest and greatest thing is. And it's kind of cool to overhear that. But at the same time, sometimes you need a break. So it is the double-edged sword.
Sorry, okay. This actually reminds me, I went on a hike recently, and there's this family behind me speaking a completely different language. I don't even know what the language was, but I could just hear certain phrases that I guess didn't have a translation, like transformer or like vector. And I'm like, these guys are talking about AI. Like, I don't even know the language, but I know
That's
I know
amazing.
those two. I know those two keywords.
Because I can't stand sometimes hiking around here because, like, shut up about tech. Like, just enjoy some trees and some fresh air. Like, shut up about it.
That's exactly, yeah, that's so funny. That's exactly what I was thinking. Like, we purposely went on that hike to kind of unplug, like get away from that. And just hearing that, I was like, just laughing in my head. Like, I'm like 99.9% sure.
That's Stacey, to your point on people's identity are wrapped up in kind of what they do and where they work. That's so true. Which is good. I think when you're young and passionate and you're like, yeah, we're changing the world with my Uber for Cats idea. It's going to be revolutionary. And like, no matter what, you can't talk them out of that. And that's cool. I think it's good to be that passionate. I think we were all there, but over time, I think I have grown tired of that as like the yardstick for like your value as an individual. It was always like, oh, where do you work? Every party or social interaction was like, oh, hey, what do you do for a living? And I was like, what? For a while, I was like, oh, that's cool. Like, I work at Netflix, and people are like, whoa, and I was like, yeah. But over time, it just becomes kind of empty, and I'd rather meet people who have other pursuits. And like, oh, you just happen to work in tech? Cool. Yeah, that's cool. Me too. So now when people ask what I do, I was like, I work in tech. That's it. And I think there's a big difference in different areas around the Bay Area. So the main areas are kind of San Francisco, the peninsula, going all the way down to San Jose. Then you have the East Bay. I live in the East Bay, and it's refreshing to live here because nobody cares where you work. Like, nobody gives a flying crap about what tech company you work at. And people are like much more authentic here. In San Francisco, that's not usually the vibe. It's always like, oh, where do you work? What kind of car are you driving? So I'll say that for the Bay Area. There's something for everybody, and that's something I do love in Silicon Valley. Is like, there's probably a town out there that has a little bit of something for you. If you like more woodsy, there's towns for that. If you want to live in the city, there's towns for that. If you want to live by the beach, there's towns for that too. And that's something that when I first moved here, everybody's like, the weather. And I was like, how good can the weather be? Oh man, I would not trade Silicon Valley weather for anything. It is incredible. People that have never lived here, you don't know what you're missing. It's great all year round.
It's like amazing in the sense because it's not like so hot that it's unbearable, but it's not so cold. Like, it's this perfect balance. I agree with you, Jem.
I feel like that kind of goes into the whole hustling. Like, you're always networking. Like, people just constantly like, oh, where do you work? Oh, you work for a big tech company? Ooh la la, let's be friends, kind of thing. I can attest with Jem, also living in the East Bay, like, people don't really care where you work. And I prefer that so much more. It's like, yeah, like, get to know someone for who they are, not their job or their title or something like that.
I'd be curious though, because all of us kind of, Augustus, I think you kind of like, we're in this world a little bit and already for your career, but I would say for Jem, Stacy, myself, we all moved into Silicon Valley. And how did being in Silicon Valley affect your career, positive or negative?
Positive for sure. Just a ton of doors opened. Like, as soon as I put a company that people recognized on my resume and where I was, the LinkedIn recruiting stream started flowing in, and it was not flowing in like that before. So that was very noticeable. So I guess in that way, we're talking about name dropping, but I guess like that for some recruiters, that immediately makes you more valuable somehow because you've got this recognizable name on your resume. So it opened a lot more doors where people are reaching out to me to like talk to them as opposed to just like applying to places that you want to.
For me specifically, like, I feel pretty fortunate, because I don't know what was before other than maybe University of Washington student web developer. But I'll say that, like, from a growth perspective, I feel being in Silicon Valley like hyper grew me to some extent, because and that's kind of like on me or you as an individual too. Like, it's just being in an environment where there's so many tech companies, like all those tech talks that companies sometimes do. Like, I know I think Ryan, maybe you even ran them. Like, there's these Netflix talks where they talked about, there's just this like culture of sharing information that tech companies have. And if you make the effort to go to them, I feel like you learn so much, and you just have a great environment to, dare I say, network with to network with others, get to know people, and I think that really helped me grow, like, both as an individual and in my career, because I just get so much exposure, and I don't think I would get that like working somewhere else necessarily.
I like that you call that out, Augustus. Like, I think that the networking is important wherever you are. It truly is. I think it time and time again. I think it's so important to spend a little bit of time networking. I don't know what that looks like for everybody. It varies. It really, truly does. But in some way, shape, or form, networking is important. And I think when being in Silicon Valley, I think there's a lot of opportunities to really go to a networking event almost every single night. And maybe that's like better or worse me saying that, but like there is absolutely a lot of opportunities to go to, like Jem said, like going down Embarcadero and you're like, oh, there's the Mozilla office. Well, Mozilla would have different meetups and you could go and listen to some amazing talks and get free pizza and, you know, drinks and all the fun stuff. And I think that in itself was kind of cool. Like I would say when I first moved out here, I attended a lot of various meetups and networking events, and I loved it. I was like, holy shit, I am talking with some amazing folks, really understanding what they're doing, what the types of things that they're trying to solve. And I love that aspect of it. Then at the same side of it is like eventually I'm like, okay, I've gone to a bunch of these, you know, they're all kind of the same. But at the same time, I'm like, it's kind of cool to have that opportunity to just really go and interact with people, to talk about the problems and challenges that they're dealing with that you're probably dealing with as well.
Yeah, it's helpful to be around here, I think, for your career. It was something we debated during the pandemic when a lot of people were moving away. Me and my partner had that discussion, which was like, should we move too? And the conclusion we came to was, nah. The fact is the offices are here and the people that make decisions live here. So there's always going to be some element of remote work, which is a good thing. But I think as we see now, looking back 4 years in, and we see return to office and things like that, it was a good call to stay here because that's kind of, I see more and more of those requirements. But overall, it is some job security knowing, you know, I can just leave and go get another job somewhere else. Granted, the market's very different than when it was all those years ago, but still, all the companies are here and I now know plenty of people. So there's definitely an influence from being here and just kind of getting out and about, being social and knowing people. You feel a little bit better about your job prospects.
What about company cultures? Working in companies in other areas of the US, or like I was in Canada before moving to Silicon Valley. What are you all feeling about, like, how does it feel differ between company culture in Silicon Valley versus other places that you've worked?
It's kind of a tough one because for me, I've worked at Atlassian the whole time that I've lived in San Francisco. And Atlassian it was founded in Australia and headquartered in Sydney. And so these offices are, you know, opened up later. And so the culture was coming from Australia. So I think that just made it a little bit different. Like, I don't think the culture totally matched a lot of the like Silicon Valley stereotypes or tropes. It, in some ways, yes, but in a lot of ways, I think it was different. So I don't know that I've had like the standard like culture of Silicon Valley. I don't think I've worked in it truly.
What is the standard though? I'm like,
I don't know.
Even as you say that, I'm like, what is it? I'm like, I agree with all the things you're saying, Stacey, but I'm like, yeah, what is that quote unquote like standard Silicon Valley culture?
I don't know. I mean, like the show Silicon Valley, right? Like there's the like a lot of stuff in that show that it's, you know, trying to make fun of, you know, the culture. Some of it's pretty based off of truth.
Oh, it totally is. We may not have Kid Rock presenting at our like, you know, conferences, but there's definitely times where I'm like, well, Evernote, I remember, I can't remember. I think Augustus, were you there when like MC Hammer was there? You know, it's like there's absolutely plays into the fact that like that kind of shit happens, but it is different. Like it's not fully, or at least I don't picture it as exactly the way it's portrayed.
Yeah, like there was never like what was some like work event where there were strippers. It's like that never
Thank God.
happened for
Yeah.
me, and like I like thankfully.
Oh my. Jeez.
I mean, come on, Augustus. Like some of the Silicon Valley companies have definitely, you know, opened our eyes to things like
They've made the news.
Yes,
for
they've made
stuff like
sure.
that. Yeah.
Stacey, that's a good way to put it. They have made the news.
Yes. I wasn't surprised about it, but that Stacy may have experienced it. That's why I had big eyes like, oh my, Stacy.
No, she
Okay.
passed
Oh,
that.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
good.
Yeah.
I have not experienced that, thankfully.
Oh, thankfully.
Jem, Augustus, what do you guys think culture-wise?
I guess there's two things kind of related to the hustling thing. It's like, people don't mind working more than the typical 9 to 5. In fact, they sometimes love it. Maybe that's partly because the office is amazing, has better furniture than your own place or something like that, and so people just love to work there nonstop. Which is totally, I honestly, it's up to you, but hopefully, like, you can respect other people's boundaries. I think that's like what's more important. If you want to do it, go for it, right? That's like one distinction that I notice. Like, my old manager in Seattle, like 5 hits, done, like I'm out of here. One thing that shocked some of my family is I guess the tenure, the typical tenure. I don't know if this is like culture specific, but it's like it's pretty common for people to like hop around, and like that's okay. I think that's like a big shock to other industries. Like, I remember when I first got a job, my dad's like, "Oh, son, you're gonna probably be there for 10 years, 20 if you're, if you really committed, but at least 10." And I remember, like, while I was at Evernote, like, I had a recruiter call me. He's like, "Wow, Augustus, I see you've been there for a really long time, 2 to 3 years. That's a long time." I'm like, "Is it? Is it a long time?" And I don't know if what this recruiter said was true, but this recruiter told me like the average tenure he saw sometimes was like 6 months. He saw people hop a lot. I was like, I don't know how true that is, but that okay, maybe that one's a little absurd.
I think
maybe he fed me.
I think it's usually the 2-year marker. Like, it's like 1.5, 2 years is like that. That's the marker where it's like people are leaving at that point. But I agree with you, Augustus, where I feel like my parents have said the same thing where they're like, "Oh, you around a bunch." And it's like, yeah, because you know why? I get increases in compensation for leaving, right? Like, I think should be rewarded for staying at a company when you know the ins and outs so much better. But anyways, that's just not how it works typically. So historically, actually, probably before Silicon Valley, that was more my mentality. Was I jumped around every 2 years. I was jumping to a new company, new role. Being in Silicon Valley, I didn't do that as much. Maybe just being at Netflix, I moved around a bunch internally, but it's just felt like I didn't do that as much, which is odd because I actually think it's probably more beneficial to jump around.
I'd say maybe not so much on company culture, maybe general culture. Tech is respected. It's like a respected field to be in, which other places I've worked or have visited, that's not necessarily the case, where like tech or IT is the cost center for the company, and they're not viewed as like, wow, they're doing super cool stuff and working on these hard problems. Whereas here, people are doing the same thing, but it's well known like these are hard problems. They're respected for it. So it's like, oh, you're a sysadmin at, I don't know, Bed Bath and Beyond in Ohio. People are like, cool, nerd. But people say you're a sysadmin here, and you're like, oh, wow, that's really hard. Like all those servers and managing the complexity. So I think that's a general change versus maybe other parts outside of not Silicon Valley, but also include New York, maybe Austin. Like there's other tech hubs around the country where it's a bit more respected. That to me is like one of the bigger changes.
That's a good call out too, Jem, too, is that like we keep referencing Silicon Valley, but like there are a lot of tech hubs that popped up. It's not just the Silicon Valley area that has a lot of amazing jobs. And so that I think is a good call out.
One thing I think culturally I noticed is just it's very young compared to my prior jobs in the Midwest. The jobs I had in the Midwest, the age range of people working were every like all the age ranges, all the way up to like close to retirement, kind of age range. I don't see that as much here for sure. Like it's very young. And maybe it's because as soon as you get into different stages of life, sometimes, let's say you want to have kids and stuff, like it's extremely expensive to have kids here and like purchase a home, like all that, American white picket fence thing. Like it's very difficult to do that here. And so maybe that contributes to that. People just move somewhere else where they can afford more, or, not have to pay crazy amounts of money for school, like all that kind of stuff. So I feel like it's very young here.
I think that's a good call out, Stacey. I was sitting there going like, oh, is that true? But I think like I've still had a decent mix, but you're right. I think at a higher percentage, it probably skews a bit younger. And to, like you said, it is the cost of living for schools and all that nonsense that goes along with having children and a family. It adds up very quickly. I think there's also just a lot more energy that goes into like, all right, yeah, like I want to like make it big in creating this tech company, or building this thing. And I think that all goes with it, and that people often do that for a short period and then say like, I want to get out, I want to go like live a different life in a maybe slower environment. Nothing bad with that, but like that might be a reason why they go to a different part of even the US.
It's also the more experience you have in tech, and maybe the older you get, by consequence, the higher the drop off rate of people that are just burnt out on tech. It's like everywhere has this, like, I think in New York it'd be finance. It's for us as tech, but every industry kind of eats young people, and people discover like if they're cut out for it or not. And Silicon Valley is that for tech. And a lot of people get here working for startups, maybe try to work their way into a bigger company if that's what they want, and then they might discover it's not for them, and then they leave and do something else. So I agree. I think it does skew a little younger, but that's kind of just a consequence of a lot of things. But a lot of it's burnout, because that is part of the hustle and grind and work culture all the time. And there's plenty of those people that are maybe not the best role models for others.
Fair enough, Jem. That's a good call out. I'd be curious for all of you too. I think that there's like pros and cons, honestly, with anything. We always talk about as engineering, there's trade-offs, but I think absolutely with living in and working in Silicon Valley, there's pros and cons. I would love to hear your thoughts on like, what are some of the pros for you all? What are some of the cons? Like, what are some of the things that you wish would change?
I think if you are in a career in tech, there are like a lot of pros. Like just being here, you're in like an incredible environment. There's so much competition, and that kind of breeds like really like good success, quite honestly. So like there's just so much opportunity here if you are working in tech. I think one of the biggest cons, less career related but more personal related, is like, if you want to raise a family or get a house, it's just very different, right? Like I'll be honest, getting a house here is very, very, very expensive. And well, I don't have kids, but I know people who have kids, and it seems kind of stressful. Part of that hustle mentality you talk about, it impacts the kids too. Like a lot of parents are very, very driven, and they push that on their kids. And I'll be honest, there's a lot of schools here that some of them are really good, but then they're also extremely competitive too, which I think we could do a whole episode on. Quite honestly, like schools, like I just recently learned like how many schools you have to apply to, and yeah, just to get your kid in, which is surreal to me. It's like, oh, I thought that was a college thing, but I guess it's a preschool, elementary school thing too now. That is.
I'm glad you called it.
What are these kids?
I'm glad you called it preschool too, Augustus, because it's not, we're talking like high schools or something. It's like literally preschool is like you have to apply to try and get in.
Yeah. I don't even know what is assessed for a preschool kid, but
I think some of the pros we discussed in terms of career mobility, even just being inspired by seeing other people working on hard problems, is like a really good feeling. And people that understand the things you're working on actually is pretty cool. I don't know if I'd invest in that heavily, but it's a nice kind of pro. Some of the cons are the Silicon Valley and people that live here are, we'll say, socially liberal, but fiscally conservative. And what I mean by that is there's such a massive wealth gap in tech, when like tech is a very small percentage of people in Silicon Valley. There's still just everything else there would be in any other city. Tech's maybe a little overweighted, but by percentage, it's not anything extraordinarily high. Like 50% of people are not working in tech or something like that. And San Francisco has the highest concentration of billionaires of anywhere in the world, any city. Yet it's also a city that can't solve its homelessness problem. And that's true across San Jose, Oakland, everywhere. And like, it doesn't make sense, like how there's so much people making money. The median cost in San Jose for a home is $2 million. $2 million. And that's the median cost. And that's true for like 2 Bay Area counties too. So like, who can afford to work there? Most people don't work at Google or Meta or the big companies. Most people are, making regular good money, but not for the Bay Area. And that always gets me as like this just really big discrepancy in how we run, how the whole area is run. And it's something I still struggle to rectify today in terms of like, we could fix this really easily. We have the money, we have the wealth, and we have the smart people to do it. Yet there's just like a general unwillingness to solve that problem. So those are things that give me pause, and I'd say are cons in the Bay Area. But I will say, if you're young and you're like, I don't care about any of that, I don't have kids, I'm going to live in a tiny apartment and hustle hard, it's a great place to live.
I mean, and also if you can get past all that, Jem, the weather is amazing.
Yeah. The pros with the weather thing, I guess, like I hate talking about weather. It sounds like I'm the most boring person in the world. But it is huge. One of the things that keeps me in this area outside of tech is being able to explore California. It is so beautiful. It's epically beautiful. Oceans, cliffs, redwoods, sequoias, like mountains, desert, high plains. There's like every different ecosystem all within like not that far. You can drive to all these different ecosystems. So even though I'm in a big city, it's very close to actually getting out and exploring and being in nature. And I treasure that a lot. Like the ridiculous amount of rent that I spend is worth being able to do that. So like that for me is a huge pro, which has nothing to do with tech, but I'm thankful tech brought me out here so that I could do that. I could experience that. And then the cons, the cons are like, I don't think we can stay here forever because like, even though I make the most money I've ever made in my entire life, I still am so fiscally conservative from my Midwestern, penny pinching upbringings that I'm like, buying a house is fiscally irresponsible. I could not even fathom putting, so like the American dream feels a little out of reach for me, even though I'm making the most money I've ever made. So that's like crazy. That's sort of bonkers to me. And that's like a bit of a con. And then same thing that Jem said, it's very soul crushing to see how the disparity of wealth and what's happening with the houseless population. It's hard to reconcile that and not, you can't not think about it as you walk around the city.
Well, I think it's even mind-boggling to me when I've seen like interns or new grads, and they're coming into Silicon Valley making like money that took me like, I don't know, 10 years to make, like, in my career, or probably more. And, they're making really good money, and all the power to them. That's so cool. But it's like not enough to even live off of, which is so sad. Like they're making money that I would have just like dreamed of, like, when I first started, and they're living in apartments with like 5-10 other people. Like it's crazy town. Like it's like, what? Like, they're making hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like we're talking like a lot of money earlier in their career, and they're like, yeah, but I still have to share this like 4-bedroom apartment, or like we have multiple people sleeping in the like living room. That's sad. Like I think that to me is like there's something wrong. Granted, yes, you get past that as you keep getting paid more money in Silicon Valley, but like that's the early days where people are getting paid a ton of money. Like it's not just a little bit of money. They're getting paid lots, and they're still like, just kind of living it like how I'd picture me making literally nothing. And they're making quite a lot of money and still having to live like that. And I think that to me it feels off.
What's shocking is none of this surprises me. I think that's the most shocking thing. It's really, really crazy.
All right, well, before we dive into picks, I would love to hear some quick words of advice for someone who's maybe thinking about moving to Silicon Valley. Maybe they're applying for roles right now. Maybe they're working remotely for a Silicon Valley company, but maybe they're actually moving to Silicon Valley for their role. I'd be curious, what advice would you give them all?
If you get an offer in Silicon Valley and you're looking for where to move, South San Francisco is not San Francisco. It is not the southern part of San Francisco. It is an entirely different city. It's not even. I don't even think it's connected.
No,
to San
it's
Francisco.
not. Like, I don't think there's any way that you can get to it easily.
Yeah, that almost got me because I was like, oh wow, rent's so cheap in South San Francisco compared to San Francisco. Learn your lesson. It's kind of depressing there.
Jem, you're not the only one. I remember an engineer I worked with at Evernote went through that same thing. Like, so many people have been like, well, it's cheaper. And there's nothing wrong with South San Francisco, but you're not in San Francisco at all.
I'll add another one on there. Don't underestimate your commute. If you're like, oh, it's only 10 miles away. Oh, man. Yeah. Oh, let me live by the beach in North Bay. And I have to get to, I don't know, Redwood City. Good luck with that. That's an hour and a half in the morning, one way. Do not underestimate that. The traffic here is terrible. It is terrible. And we won't invest in good public transportation because people love their houses. Yeah, I learned that lesson too.
Yeah, I think we forgot to talk about that. The traffic here is crazy. Like, yes. that is a huge thing. I can't believe we missed that. That is a huge thing. Traffic here is nothing like anywhere else, except maybe LA. I heard LA is pretty crazy too.
LA is pretty bad. I've definitely suffered through that. I think LA is worse, but I still feel like the Bay Area is really bad.
We'll talk about weather again. Here's some advice. If if you're moving to San Francisco and you're thinking about neighborhoods, if you are a person, like we talked about how the weather is beautiful and there's a lot of sunshine and it's, good temperatures. It also is very foggy depending on where you live in the city. So if you're like trying to figure out where you want to live and maybe you have seasonal affective disorder, or maybe you want to see the sunshine more often than not, like stay on the east side of the peninsula and not the west side, because you're going to get a lot of fog on the west side. Those kind of things. There's like a little detail, but it can really matter, if you get really bummed out by gray skies all the time.
I mean, we have our own little app, Stacy, too, that is like it's like San Francisco has so many microclimates that it's just like we actually have an app that it shows you what the weather is in all the different areas because it can vary so drastically. I think that's a great piece of advice, just if you're like, especially moving to San Francisco, it's like an area can make all the difference in what the weather is. All right, well, that's probably a good time for us to dive into picks for this episode. In each episode, the Front End Happy Hour podcast, we like to choose picks of things that we just found interesting, want to share with all of you. Stacy, you want to start us off?
Sure. Just have one pick today. It's a song called Ritual, Evocation by John Hopkins. It's a collab, so it's like a bunch of different people. Vlania, Seven Rays, Ishq, Sharif, Hashizume. I'm not even pronouncing any of these names right, probably, but it's an awesome collab. It's a new album that's coming out, and it was described as like a 41-minute electronic symphony built from cavernous subs, hypnotic drumming, and transcendent melodic interplay. It's a really great song to listen to with your headphones on, and if you want to maybe step away from tech and do a little meditation and calm yourself, it's a great song for that.
Which we all need once in a while. I like that, Stacy. Augustus, what do you have for us?
Oh, yes. I have two picks. One pick maybe was better in the boot camp. It's kind of related to that episode, but I think it's still relevant. It's from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I don't know how many people remember there was this boot camp called Lambda School that had these kind of predatory, maybe predatory is not the right word, but they had these pretty misleading like promises of like helping students, like they don't pay anything, but then they take a huge cut of your salary. Well, it just so happens actually this year in April, there's a huge hammer that got swung on them. I think the parent company is called Bloom Tech. And so there's a huge win for all the graduates. Like a lot of them all their agreements are like they're not being forced depending on when they got graduated. The companies are getting fined tremendously for that. So it's just like not okay. And just a reminder for if you're taking on a boot camp, really read the contract, really understand what you're getting yourself into. I'm super happy for all these people who like won't have to like commit. I think they had to give like 50% of their salary for a few years after they graduated. That was like the agreement for a lot of these people. And so a lot of them after this, they don't have to do that. So yeah, so that's my first pick. There will be a link. You can read more about it. And then my second pick, which we haven't done a front end pick for a while, or maybe we have, I don't remember, but it's deep into the so React 19 release candidates out, which if you don't know, React 19 has a compiler that's part of it now, and they actually have this thing called playground.react.dev. It is so cool. It takes your code and shows you what the compiler does side by side, how it transpiles your code. It's just like I just thought it was such a cool tool that they made for the release of it. So I think it's worth checking out.
Very cool. I have not seen that. That's really cool. Jem, what do you have for us this episode?
Ironically, I don't have any picks. I'm looking through all the things, and I think I've just been working a lot. So I have nothing of interesting to share with you all, unfortunately.
Jem, I expected a Valley Silicon pick for this episode.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just off my game. I think it's the first time I've ever not had a pick. So
all right,
maybe I should rethink my life right now.
That can happen though. We all go through those times where it's just like, yeah, I've been so deep in work and like life, and yeah, it's tough. I only have one pick for this episode, and Jem, it's going to be funny because it's like I was trying to pull out different picks for this episode as well, and I was like, oh, we haven't picked the video that you and I did where we talked about like going into leadership and like what that's like and really sharing our perspectives of what that looks like. And so I'm going to pick that as like our YouTube video that we had done where we had a discussion where it was like, yeah, what does that look like? What have we experienced? How do we think about leadership? I really enjoyed it. I had a blast doing it. So I hope others enjoy watching it. So I'm going to make that my pick. So yes, Jem, I feel like I was trying to find picks and it was really hard this week. So I stole that one. All right. Well, thank you all for listening to our episode. As always, you can find us on whatever you like to listen to Front End Happy Hour on. We, available on all the things you listen to podcasts on. But we're also on YouTube at Front End HH, as well as Twitter at Front End HH. Yes, it's still Twitter. It's not X. I don't know where that thing is coming from, but it is still Twitter. It will redirect to some x.com, but it's still Twitter. Any last words?
Ding, ding.
That works for me.
Ding, ding.